Folks, it's been an interesting week for me. It's been the last week of classes here at ASU. Don't have too many finals, and if I did, I took it last week. Nonetheless, I've been pretty tired. I've been pretty busy, but so has Ohio sports as we talk about the NFL draft, MLB, MLS, and we wrap up the Cavs season on this episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. Hello, everyone. I'm Mahir Hassan, and thanks for tuning in. We'll get right to it since there's a lot of action, starting off with what took place at the NFL draft yesterday and what's going to happen this weekend. We'll start off with the Bengals. The Browns did not do any work last night. They did not have a first-round pick, nor did they have a second, I believe because of the Deshaun Watson trade that occurred last year. But back to the Bengals. They took defensive end Myles Murphy with the 28th pick. And I think simply put, and I think a lot of Bengals Nation will agree with me, they should have taken Michael Mayer. You know, he was circled on my resume, on my hit list, especially knowing when you get a guy like Irv Smith as tight end. No disregard to Irv, but he hasn't seen that much action in Minnesota, and neither has a lot of tight ends like Irv Smith. It will be interesting to put a guy like him at tight end one, presuming that the team doesn't get a tight end in this draft. Kind of leads me to my next point. And again, I've talked about how the Bengals have played this year and how the Bengals have played over the years and how the draft has really helped them out. Again, you don't have like a number one pick to get Joe Burrow. You don't have a number five pick to get Jamar Chase. But at the same time, I would have to argue that for me, the Bengals don't have a successful draft, in my opinion, unless they take either a tight end or a running back. And I would probably say this in the second or third round, maybe the fourth overall. You look at the tight ends that are still on the board. Of course, Michael Mayer's there, but his overall rank was 19 going over to the draft. So he's falling quite a bit. Not as bad as Will Levis, but it's still pretty interesting. When you look down the list, I should preface the Bengals will have the 29th pick in the second round. And granted that they do not get any trades, that will be where they are picking today. Luke Musgrave could be an interesting choice, although he himself is actually 31 overall ranked. So he also skinning a little bit. Darnell Washington, also on the hit list overall, and could be playing some tricks and flicks over there. The biggest match as of right now on what could happen with the Bengals in terms of who do they get. Right now, 30th overall best player on the list right now. Tucker Kraft. He's a tight end at South Dakota State, and he's 61st overall ranked, 6th ranked in the tight end position. He could be an interesting one overall. Again, haven't heard from him in a while, and you don't hear much from South Dakota and North Dakota overall. Sorry to anybody who is from any of those states, but he looks pretty solid overall. 6'5", 254 pounds. A quote has the speed and toughness to make plays down the seam, almost like CJ Uzama to some extent. You know, the Bengals saw that, especially over the past few years before he ended up leaving to go to the Jets. So he's a good option. Sam Laporta could also be there too. A crisp running route. I'm reading some of this off ESPN, but he could also be a pretty good option. Darnell Washington. I mean, this dude is a tank. 6'7", 264 pounds as a tight end. If he is still on the board tonight, I think the Bengals got to grab him. I don't know if he will. He's a little bit higher up, and maybe the Bengals will have to trade up to try to get one, but the Bengals will have to have some sort of initiative, especially in that tight end position, if they want to make an impact today and in the second round, especially. And it also goes back to what I was saying about the running backs. Obviously, Samaje Perine left. He's now with the Broncos. So now the question becomes, do you find a replacement at RB2? Because it doesn't seem like the Bengals have some sort of personnel. So there's a high chance we're going to have our RB2, rather the Bengals will have their RB2 come out of this draft. It is very, very possible. That being said, the question becomes, who do you take? And I think more importantly, what style do you choose? What type of running back? You have to understand, Samaje Perine was 5'11, and he was a pretty big guy. He could barrel guys down and be really tough on the ground. You have that type of running back. And then on the other side, you have a guy like Deuce Vaughn. So, like I said, you have maybe a guy like Samaje Perine, and then maybe you have a Bengals player like Giovanni Bernard. And those are the two types that the Bengals are deciding upon when it comes to what type of running back do you want? Do you want a guy like Zach Charbonnet who can be almost a little bit like Samaje Perine? Or do you want Deuce Vaughn, who, shortest player in the league if he is drafted, would be a lot like Giovanni Bernard, who is actually enjoying retirement right now after playing 10 seasons in the league? And that's the big question overall for this Bengals side. Right now, if you look at running backs, you have Deuce Vaughn, who's at around 191. So he's probably not going to be taken first round, second round, third round. You're looking more at fourth or fifth for him. Would be a very good pickup if it were to happen. Some interesting games or interesting running backs overall in terms of who can really show up in the Giovanni Bernard type category. As I talked about earlier, you had Deuce Vaughn. Um, I talked about some other ones. Keaton Mitchell, he's ranked 217 overall. So again, I should probably preface, maybe not the third round, but maybe fourth or fifth, and you could have a very good RB2 at hands. And who knows? I mean, we got to pay Joe Mixon. The Bengals got to pay Joe Mixon at some point, and if not, then they're going to let him go, and this RB2 is going to take over. Keaton Mitchell, not bad, 5'8", 179. Sean Tucker, the Syracuse running back, 5'9", 207 pounds. So kind of a little bit of a median between the Giovanni Bernard and the Samaje Perine type category. But many types of players overall. Mohamed Ibrahim of Minnesota, another guy. So a lot of great options for Cincinnati if they want to take a type of running back. I would probably say more fourth round than third round. But hey, if you want to take a third round and take someone like Charbonnet, Kendre Miller, some really slick guys on the ball that are almost like a Samaje Perine, go for it, because this team definitely has the wheel power for it. I talked Browns, and the Browns are not doing pretty good in terms of play overall, and in terms of the types of picks they have in the draft. Pretty chill so far. Their first pick of the draft is going to be at number 74, and they actually got that from the Jets. The other one is a compensatory pick, which will be number 98. So two picks right now for tonight's draft period, which should be starting right when this is released. And for them, like I said, didn't get a first or second round because of the Deshaun Watson trade. The biggest question for me, and I think the biggest personnel, in my opinion, on how the Browns go to shaping this draft comes down to Jim Schwartz. Coming in as the defensive coordinator, of course, brought in a lot of key guys like Brandon Graham, like Fletcher Cox, who nonetheless, really key guys for Philly that helped anchor a defense that won the Super Bowl overall, strip sack against Tom Brady as well. I mean, Cox and Graham were very good at that, and it happened when it mattered most in Super Bowl 52. Back to my point though, you want guys that can make a difference. You know, you have the Myles Garretts, you have the Jadeveon Clowneys, you have the Grant Delpits on this team, but I think in terms of the squad, it's just rounding out this defense. In my opinion, they kind of have to take a pick out of the Steelers book, where the Steelers, they don't have the best offense, but boy, do they have a killer defense that can really mess with some really good teams. And I think the Browns have to take a little bit of that piece, where whether it's fleshing out their roster, whether it's trying to get another starter, I think especially it's important to look at the linebacker position to try to get someone forward over there. That could be an interesting talk for the Browns on who do they want to draft going overall number 74. Got some interesting ones on the board. Drew Sanders out of Arkansas, ranked number 70 in terms of inside linebackers. Henry To'oTo'o, as well from Alabama. Alabama's been known for some heavy hitters as well. So a lot of key guys in terms of the defense overall. Again, you could go offensive line, but I think in general for Cleveland, you know that this is not going to be your priority. Your priority is free agency. Your priority is what do we have right now with Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson, and how do you go forward with it? But nonetheless, I think this draft could be very complementary to how the Browns shape up and how they shape their offseason overall. Speaking of offseason, I know this is not Ohio, but I do want to talk about the biggest trade and probably the biggest acquisition of this free agency and offseason period, which is Aaron Rodgers. If you don't know, Aaron Rodgers went to the Jets, and in return, the Packers have gotten a few interesting picks overall, including first and second, and some interesting conditional picks as well, depending on how Aaron Rodgers does over time. And the question becomes, Daniel Orlovsky noted this on NFL Live, or rather on his Twitter page, where you have Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, Aaron Rodgers, and Deshaun Watson. Eight quarterbacks, eight, for the most part, elite quarterbacks in the AFC. And obviously, one of those teams or one of those quarterbacks is not going to make the playoffs. Simply put, it's a crazy, crazy outlook on how you look at this team. And I think especially for the Browns, I mean, obviously we didn't see much from Deshaun Watson last year, and what we saw was rather mediocre from what we saw in Texas with Houston before all the fallout began with the therapist. But back to my point, we've definitely seen Deshaun Watson show up, and I think for him, it's almost to prove himself to say, you know what, this is the Browns is not a chance for me to kind of level out my career. I got a chance to really show myself. I have got 17 games in the year to really be that guy. And I think that's definitely the case for Deshaun Watson. On the other side, you got Joe Burrow overall, and a lot of people have been saying, you know what, the Jets are the best team in the AFC. They're going to win an AFC championship. Joe Namath said that Aaron Rodgers could take this team to a Super Bowl. And my question on the other side is for the Bengals is, does Joe Burrow still fall in that category? I think more importantly, again, you can't control what Aaron Rodgers does, but you can control what Joe Burrow does. And I think the more we see these mistake games from Joe, and we saw it especially earlier on in the season last year, the more we start to question, especially if Aaron Rodgers does good and get back to his prime days in Green Bay, how much does Joe Burrow still be in the top three when it comes to AFC quarterbacks and almost NFL quarterbacks in that certain category? That would be a very interesting type topic to consider overall, and more importantly, to consider in how this hierarchy works. Obviously, it was Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Deshaun Watson for all this time. And then obviously the news happens with Deshaun. He moves to Cleveland. And then a year later, Joe Burrow leads the Bengals to a Super Bowl with very interesting quarterback play and a very jaded offensive line. And still, you say, well, Joe Burrow is now a top three quarterback. And to be honest with you, especially after the divisional game against the Bills, you could consider him as number two to Patrick Mahomes in the AFC. And in that regards, probably number two in the NFL. It's a very interesting type play overall. If you're wondering how the head to head works, in this upcoming season, Deshaun Watson's going to face off against Aaron Rodgers, presuming both of those players do not get hurt once this year in Cleveland when the Jets and Browns face off. We don't know when it's going to happen. Should be happening soon, knowing the schedule will be released sometime in May. So we'll get a good idea on when that game will happen very soon. And who knows? We could see that game as a good primetime matchup. I don't know about Thursday Night Football. Would be a very good upgrade, though, from what we saw on Thursday Night Football this year, though. And with Joe Burrow, faced off against Rodgers in 2021, that was the game where Mason Crosby and Evan McPherson were missing kicks left, right, and center. It seemed like nobody wanted to win it until Crosby and the Packers won it on a game-winning field goal to win that one 25-22 in Cincinnati. So both Ohio quarterbacks 0-1 against Aaron Rodgers. Who knows for the Bengals? If they face the Jets in the playoffs, that could change. For Deshaun Watson and the Browns, that could change in the regular season. So interesting moves in the NFL offseason. Interesting moves in MLB as well. And we'll start off with the Cincinnati Reds, a really, really good weekday series. Probably the best series I've seen out of them, maybe since their series at Yankee Stadium where they swept the Yankees at the time, one of the best teams, if not probably the best record in the AL. Really, really good performance then, and a really good performance against the Texas Rangers, number one in the AL East. Again, I have to give credit to Sarah. She's a broadcaster who works with iHeartRadio in Cincinnati, and she put this out with the Rays series, and she put it out again with the Rangers. Really, the question of how much or how many wins do you think the Reds will win? And I kind of look at it to say, how much is this considered competitive, or rather a good moral victory for the Reds, knowing that's what's more important, at least to my philosophy. Nonetheless, a lot of people, including myself, said the Reds got to win one game. Well, they won one game. Walk off again, 7-6 on a Monday night. Coolish night in Cincinnati, able to get it done. That's not all, though. On Tuesday, they have a 6-run, 8-inning. Came into that inning down 6-1, and they ended out 7-6. Got it done. They were able to get the save overall. On Wednesday, too, Nick Senzel, first walk-off home run, and the Reds win 5-3. All really good series, all really good games, all really good performances too, especially with Graham Ashcraft again, dedicated to his performance to his late grandmother who passed away not so long ago. So again, respect to the Ashcraft family, and again, kudos to Graham Ashcraft overall to what he's done overall. And for the Reds too, I mean, especially I've noticed this too when I lived in Cincinnati, where when you look at these April series, nobody shows up, figuratively speaking, in the sense that you have audience members, or rather the attendance, in 4 digits. You don't get above 10,000. And especially when you have a night where it's like 40s in mid-April, it's cold, people are shivering, and the Reds are able to get it done. Again, the atmosphere does not feel like October. The weather does, even in mid-April. That's what you get with Cincinnati weather. But back to my point, that's something you got to say. This team is coming to play. And after being swept on the road by the Pirates, that's a very good response for them to really get some confidence back. The question is, can they take it to the West Coast as they face the A's this weekend? Could be their last trip out to Oakland, as the A's could be headed to Las Vegas. Should be an interesting game, knowing that the A's have gone 5-21 this season. The Reds, on the other hand, 1-9 on the road. So not the most ideal record, not by any stretch of the imagination for Cincinnati, and a chance to maybe get better. And now on to Cleveland. They also have not done so well in recent history. 12-13 overall. They went 1-2 versus the Rockies at home. That is now the third consecutive series where they have lost. And more importantly, in those series, they have lost the first 2 games, and then the last game they've won. Kind of weird, but true. And again, a lot of users like McNeil, again, a quite proficient blogger that loves tweeting about Cleveland, he even talked about how this idea that if the game was just decided off what the Guardians did in the last game of the series, they'd probably be World Series champs. They'd be as good as the Rays right now. And yet they're not. It's kind of the intricacies overall on how this MLB schedule works. Very, very interesting, though, down the stretch. And I talked about it before. It asks some questions on what the Guardians can do about consistency overall. And it's almost comparing yourself that you don't really lose too many roster spots, and yet you are still in this position where you are mediocre. You're not in the position where you were last year, where you're AL Central champs. You beat the Rays. You take the Yankees to 5. And there's no sense of that at all from the Guardians. And I was a little lenient towards them a few weeks ago, said, you know what? They're facing the Mariners, they're facing the Yankees, teams that were in the playoffs last year. But now I'm really starting to ask some questions on what the Guardians can do down the stretch. Again, maybe we get some more questions, maybe we get some answers as the Guardians head to Fenway to take on the Boston Red Sox. And this is an interesting commentary on my point, but what we've seen from the MLB, where a lot of teams are facing off against a lot of opponents, in some cases, they're facing every opponent in the league, every team in the league. And we're almost seeing that reflected in the standings overall. Take, for example, the Guardians and the Red Sox. The Guardians come into the series 12 and 13. The Red Sox come in 13 and 13. Weirdly enough, the Red Sox are dead last in the AL East. Granted, it's an AL East that includes the Tampa Bay Rays, right now the best team in the MLB, and a lot of great stalwarts as well, including the great New York Yankees. And yet, the AL Central has the Minnesota Twins, who are first. 3 games behind them, or around 3 games behind them, are the Cleveland Guardians. And that's pretty much it. Everybody else is not playing well in that division. It's very interesting and very lopsided too. I mean, the fact that you could have, you could have maybe 3 AL East teams as wild cards. Holy smokes, that would be something. That would be something down the stretch. A little bit based, but still okay. And I would definitely consider something to be worked out. Again, it's a very good thing that a lot of teams that would probably be beaten by some of their in division opponents do get a chance to branch out and maybe show dominance in other places. Very interesting, though, on how this AL East sets up. They're kind of becoming a juggernaut over the past few years, if you haven't seen overall. Maybe the Guardians can get it done. They can take a series for once, and maybe, who knows, they can win one of the first 2 games. I mean, if you're a better going into the series, you probably got money on the Red Sox winning tonight and tomorrow, and then maybe the Guardians take it on Sunday, but who knows? Should be interesting down the stretch. And for the Guardians, who knows? Maybe they can turn it around just like the Reds did earlier this week. We're moving from the baseball diamond to the soccer pitch and MLS. FC Cincinnati and Columbus Crew both played 2 games this week. One of them was an MLS matchup. One of them was with US Open Cup, which was with a lower division opponent. We'll start off with the Orange and Blue first, back in winning ways as they beat the Portland Timbers 2-1 and beat their former USL rival Louisville City 1-0 in the third round of the US Open Cup. We're definitely starting to see the defense show up. And again, I've talked about it this year, but especially after that response to St. Louis, they needed that. They absolutely needed a type of victory that occurred. And I think the offense did too. And more importantly, I think we're starting to see Sergio Santos play a really big role in this team. It's not the idea that, sure, like when it matters most, he may miss the big shots or he gets something in like a cagey game overall, but in the end, it's just a goal. It happened against Chicago where the final score was 3-all. And Santos also scored the lone goal for Cincinnati when they played St. Louis City SC. But we're really starting to see the confidence grow, and my confidence grow in Sergio Santos, especially after the Brenner news was made public this week and made official. He will be with the team until July 1st when he heads to Udinese in Italy. Very good for Santos. Brandon Vasquez also involved with a goal. It's really great to see that tandem show up, especially after a Portland side that was starting to show some momentum against Seattle. We saw it earlier on in the game, too, where a lot of their shots were coming in, but you have to give credit to what Nick Hagglund, Yerso Mosquera, and even Matt Miazga has done overall. A lot of chances blocked, and that's what you want to see out of a great defense. And speaking of defenders, again, I've talked about this before. Alvaro Barreal, not necessarily seen as a left wing back, but he's definitely seen as a defender. At least on MLS fantasy, he is. So in that regards, he's definitely seen as a guy who can really show up in big moments, and more importantly, show up when it matters most, especially when it comes on the wings, when it comes to tracking back, getting wingers on the other side. You haven't seen many people get past Alvaro Barrial, and that is very, very true down the stretch. And on the other side, this dude's been putting up assists. He's been taking corners. He had the assist to Sergio Santos' goal, which, by the way, nominated for the goal of the week for MLS. Very, very good overall, and a lot to be proud of when it comes to this FC Cincinnati side. That being said, you have a big, big game on a Saturday. They're heading to Foxborough to take on the New England Revolution. And it's probably a good thing that they ended up resting their starters on Wednesday. Some of the guys like Barrial, like Vasquez, ended up coming on as substitutes later in that matchup. But for the most part, it looked pretty decent overall. When I say decent, I mean just the idea that it looked very solid. And you also have Brandon Vasquez, who gets to take an entire week off. Same goes for Matt Miazga after both of them played against Mexico for the U.S. men's national team. My biggest question for FC Cincinnati, and I think it goes back to that St. Louis matchup where you have the fans going on, and no disrespect to New England, they've been a classic MLS team down the stretch, but the atmosphere is just not the same at Gillette Stadium as it is at City Park. It just isn't overall. I think the biggest question for New England is keep a big eye on Vrioni. They've got a stacked team overall. Vrioni started to get it in a rush. Borrero is back from suspension. And not to mention, you have Gustavo Bo also there. And later this year, we could see Adam Buxa coming back to that squad. Very, very good attack. And not to mention, DeJuan Jones, kind of very similar to Alvaro Barrial. Could be playing left mid, could be playing left wing back, could be playing left back. Either way, would be very, very good down the stretch. Interesting nuggets for this game, too. This is the first time in MLS history that two teams have met up with both of them having at least 20 points through the first 10 matches. Interesting fact. Not much I can say about it other than that being an interesting fact. Also, an interesting fact, FC Cincinnati has equaled their points totaled from 2 years ago. One of those years where they got the wooden spoon. And that was actually their last year. They got the wooden spoon before Pat Noonan was able to step in. And we're seeing an interesting battle in terms of coaches in this game where you got Bruce Arena, you got Pat Noonan. And it's a very, very kind of generational type game overall. Again, when you look at this game, you talk about the coaches. Arena on one side, Noonan on the other. Both have interesting philosophies down the stretch, and both of which have been a part of excellence. Of course, Bruce Arena took DC United to MLS Cups, took LA Galaxy to MLS Cups, and he could do the same with New England, especially how they've played. And Pat Noonan on the other side has definitely shown it this year. Was an assistant to Jim Curtin, of course, the Jim Curtin that was able to lead Philadelphia into a perennial playoff powerhouse. Although they've been a little wonky this year, has still remained true. And it's definitely seen with what Noonan has done in his first year, especially after those first results last year, and how this team has played more fluidly overall. We've definitely seen that Noonan has been putting his own philosophy onto this team that has backed up the type of talent that they've had to make it almost more fluid in ways and not more do you just base it off Acosta, Brenner, and Vasquez? And how do you get the whole team, especially that back line that struggled last year, involved in key situations? And that might be the key if Cincinnati were to get points in this game, is how do they try to control the pace and how do they control the environment and control what they can do in a harsh road environment in Foxborough to try to get a result here, because a result against New England would really be telling on who runs the East and who gets a chance to really go to the MLS Cup final and really be a part of the power rankings. And that's my really big preview for this one. My one concern, and I've said this time and time and again. I've even gone on rants on this, but how much can MLS do to get Jake Zivin and Taylor Twellman on an FC Cincinnati game? They're going to be presumably, they're going to be on the road in Nashville and Atlanta in what should be an interesting one. But nonetheless, Jake Zivin and Taylor Twellman have done a great job this year with Apple TV. And that being said, you have the top two teams in the Eastern Conference facing off, and they're not in the booth. I don't understand it. I don't know whether or not Taylor wants to head back to Gillette Stadium. I mean, knowing his love for the Revolution and for playing soccer, he probably would. And yet we see this kind of discourse in ways on how this does work down the stretch. I'd really want to have a conversation with Apple TV to really ask them how in the world are they not doing that many Eastern Conference games? And I think more importantly, why are they only showcasing the rivalries at this point? Showcase some of the best games down the stretch because this is an interesting schedule. And I think some of it comes down to MLS season pass and what is determined a free game. Some of it is just decided on what's the rivalry, what's the sensation around the game. And yet I just talked to you about Bruce Arena against Pat Noonan, which could be a generational talent. We could be talking about Pat Noonan the way we're talking about Bruce Arena, how we've been talking about Bruce Arena for the past few years or so in who knows, like 30, 40 years. And yet here we are. Just interesting down the stretch. And now on to Columbus. A little bit of a benefit for you guys. They'll be facing Miami on Saturday. It is free on Apple TV, which is pretty good overall after you've heard me go on rants over there. So, looking at what they've done, they lost 1-0 to Charlotte. Karol Swiderski with the goal for the Crowns. It was a good goal, too. I think it won MLS Goal of the Week. Pretty interesting one down the stretch. Beat Indy 11 1-0 in U.S. Open Cup play midweek. Some changes overall. Zelarayan, Matan, Aiden Morris, and Ramirez were all rested. Backline-wise, the only change was Quinton playing on Wednesday, while former FC Cincinnati defender Gustavo Vallecilla started on Saturday. And again, we're starting to see where Christian Ramirez is starting to score. Should have scored there in the 20th minute. I think definitely being a threat in the middle. Cucho did play on Wednesday, though. So that's a very interesting question on what Wilfred Nancy wants to do with this side going forward. Do you want to play a two tandem, which I've talked about on this podcast before, or do you want to start only one? I think knowing Cucho's still in recovery, I wouldn't be surprised if Ramirez gets the start, but I think in 2 to 3 weeks, we could see Cucho back in the starting lineup. Again, back to the game on Saturday. That is this past Saturday against Charlotte. We saw the Crowns take a lot of multiple touches in the box, and some of it, I think, just came down to the stupidity of their attackers. Granted, they won the game, but the one time they had a significant one-time shot, it ended up in the back of the net. And had they done that a few more times, I think this could have been easily like a 3-0 game. You compare Charlotte's chances to Columbus' chances in that game. Columbus had a lot of chances, but many of them were blocked. Even when Zelarayan was getting his chance, he didn't get a header off towards the death, but it was saved at the end. Would be interesting to see how Columbus responds. And hey, they're at home. And I've talked about it before. Lower.com field has been an absolute fortress this year. Columbus has not dropped a point in that building this entire season. So we talked about that. And I think more importantly, Aiden Morris had a chance to and probably could have gotten the goal. It was called off for VAR. The commentators talked about this in the broadcast where when the place where they paused the video, where they called it offside, it almost showed that the ball was at Morris's feet, almost to his feet, and not when it was initially passed. When the ball was at his feet, he was pretty obviously offside. But when he was not, it was hard to tell. And maybe that's why it ended up happening. But I think the refs should have done at least a little bit more job on scrutinizing where that ends up going. And last but not least here on the episode, Looking at the Cavs, they ended out their season on Wednesday, falling to the Knicks at home, lost that series in the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs in five. Overall, just looked really flat and underwhelming, especially for a team that was praised for having great guard play and especially physicality. I mean, you got two centers in Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. You've got two great guards in Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland. It just didn't seem like there was a type of tangible connection overall. And it almost kind of was a little bit dampening, especially for the atmosphere in Cleveland that wasn't that raucous, but was definitely ready for the playoff atmosphere. And especially for the way they've played overall. I mean, you get to the number 4 seed, and this is the first time you make the playoffs since LeBron left in 2018. And it's a great group overall. It's safe to say Cleveland's got their basketball team back, especially from what we've seen this season. And I think more importantly, this is a good starting group. You have about at an average of about 26 years old or so. And more importantly, this team is reaching their peak per se when it comes to basketball play, or they're around that peak, maybe 2 or 3 more years. And I think this team really has a chance to shine. The one point I would say, and I would actually take this from the Knicks, what they did this season, and especially in that playoff, I think it has to be more of a gear. Maybe it has to be going on what happens with Bickerstaff. Maybe it goes to what happens in the philosophy. Maybe you get some talent guys for the bench. But either way, it just seems like this team is lacking a next gear to put them into level. Obviously, I talked about them like there was a big discourse between them and say like the Sixers, Bucks, and Celtics. But we've also seen a discourse between them and the Knicks, which ended up happening in this series overall. Nonetheless, Ohio has a lot to be proud of the Cavs this year. Donovan Mitchell, player of the year. We knew that when the Cavs got him, this was going to be something special. And to go from being on the fringes of play-ins and not making the playoffs to becoming a constant playoff team, and which I think will happen next year, especially if they keep up the type of production, what we saw from the regular season, playoffs aside, in what we've seen in this team. I also think about this as well, and it goes back to Giannis's quote after the Bucks ended up losing to the Heat in five, where he basically questioned the reporter and said, "Here's the thing: this season was not a failure. Michael Jordan won the title 6 times in the 9 years he didn't. Is that considered a failure?" He basically questioned the reporter that way, and I think the same goes for the Cavs because, granted, it was underwhelming. Granted, this team could have done better. And granted, I do not want Knicks fans to be hooting and hollering, especially knowing that they could make the conference finals and give them the hope that they could be making the NBA finals. That is a scary thing in my book. Nonetheless, it is interesting to see overall how the Cavs have grown as a squad. And it goes to Mitchell, it goes to Bickerstaff, it goes to the entire group overall. This is the first time the Cavs have made the playoffs without LeBron since the 1997 to 98 season, 25 years ago, and 5 years before LeBron James was drafted by the Cavs. Keep in mind, in that stint where he was in Miami, obviously did not make it. And they haven't been the 4th seed since 1995 and 1996. That year, of course, when Chicago and Michael Jordan, speaking of Jordan, were absolutely electric, 72-10 on the year. Somehow you just shake your head and say, this is how the playoffs work. I mean, you think about it, you have the Miami Heat and the New York Knicks, the number 8 seed against the number 5 seed for a conference semi. The winner of that is going to be playing in the final. It's crazy. One of those teams is playing the Sixers or the Celtics, a group of favorites. You're seeing the same on the West, or rather, you could see the same on the West. The Suns and the Nuggets are playing off. You got favorite against favorite. And both tonight, or very soon, you have the Lakers and the Warriors with a chance to close out their series, both of which trying to close that out at home. Works very clear, and we could have a LeBron versus Steph conference semifinal in the West. Quite interesting battles, and it's almost unusual in ways. And maybe it's a little bit of a grace period for the Cavs. Maybe it's a grace period for the NBA in general to say, you know what, the teams are great, but sometimes things happen. Maybe Jimmy Butler happens. Maybe Jalen Brunson happens. But nonetheless, things happen down the stretch for this side, and all you can do really is rebound, come back next year, and be stronger as ever. So that's it of this episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. I talked about the NFL draft, talked to MLB, MLS, and wrapping up the Cavs season. Tune in next week when I have a lot to talk about once again, about teams from the great state of Ohio. I'm Mahir Hassan, and as former Cincinnati news anchor and mayor Jerry Springer once said, be kind, take care of yourself and of others, stay safe, and I will see you next week.